We used that framework with our study of predictors of that parent-reported thriving. We tried to say in youth with intellectual disability, those with and without autism, what predicts in that sample, in that Special Olympics sample, those Cs, and why? Can we explain that? Okay. So this was a study that we recently published that came out of funding from Sport Canada because it was a sports study and SSHRC. This is a subgroup that I'm presenting of a larger study. The actual subgroup that I'm presenting is on 330, that was in this study, 330 youth, young athletes in Special Olympics Ontario. Okay. They all had, these were groups that had verified intellectual disability. There were other athletes that didn't, and they're still very important to our research, but for this study we had to be a bit more constrained. These are all athletes involved, registered with Special Olympics Ontario between 11 and 22 years of age. A bit more than half were male, 60% were male, and these are not elite athletes. And when I say Special Olympics athletes, I'm not talking about people who are traveling to World Games and competing at an international level. These are people who are living in our communities, in our backyards, right? They're going to their rec club or they're going to the local gym to train on the weekends. They're involved, most of them involved in a very local manner because of their age and what they're experiencing. Okay? About 50%, like this is just to give you that instance for those of you interested in sport, that about half participate in only local level experiences. Another third did things regions, so it's kind of like if like Richmond was, participated in an event with, West Vancouver, and then there'd be like provincial one meets, very few were there, or even national. So you can see it's not an elite group here, okay? I don't actually need to go into lots about the child and parent demographics. It's not that important to this study, to the talk today. There was varying degrees of developmental disability reported by families. This is, again, a very select group of families where most of the athletes were living with their parents. Most of the parents had two-parent households. These were young mothers mostly who were reporting. About 80% were mothers and most were married. So it's a subgroup here. This is all in Ontario. We had about a quarter of the sample who were from a rural or remote region of the province. So it's not all Toronto. So it's not all the city. But because of this age, it makes sense that 44% of the sample was from the suburbs. Right? These are mostly youth that we're talking about here. There was a varying degrees of education level, so there was some nice representativeness. It wasn't just a unique university-educated sample. The slides you have are actually a bit outdated. The point is, of this larger group of 330, about 30% of them had a diagnosis of ASD. So about a third of the sample had a diagnosis of ASD, which provided us an opportunity to say, okay, how did those athletes with ASD differ from athletes who have an intellectual disability without ASD? In terms of the 6 Cs and in terms of these other components. Okay? There are lots of non-mutually exclusive categories. Down syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, fetal alcohol or FASD was at 7%. But what we really compared with this study was those with an identification of ASD to those without. Okay? Well, so how were they different? Well, there were no age differences, which was good. The group with ASD was more likely to be male, which is what we expect in kind of ratios. About 78% were male versus 59%. There were no differences in independent living skills or in cognitive kind of functioning between our two groups. And the group with ASD and intellectual disability had more difficulties in social communication than those without, which also makes sense because they have a diagnosis of ASD. We did mention, I give you this information because this was not just a study of thriving, okay? We measured the same thing, those behavior and emotional problems too, right? So we measured those and actually rates were lower than you would have expected based on that first slide that I showed you, which again points to this being a slightly biased sample of more agentic, already healthier individuals. But there was higher rates of emotional symptoms, higher rates of hyperactivity, and of peer problems, as you might expect, in those athletes who had ASD compared to those similar athletes with an intellectual disability without ASD. So they were struggling more according to parent report. But what about thriving? Okay, so this is, I think, a very interesting slide. What we saw is that when we asked those same questions about thriving, and this is about percent that parents agreed, you can see that in both groups, what do we see? In the blue lines, right? The blue bars, that's our group with ASD, right? Many parents, you can see one of two things here. It depends if your glass is half full or empty. Many parents, So many parents, did agree, many parents of youth with ASD, for example, did agree that my child is connected to others, right, with that kind of global statement, right, at about 80% of the sample. There was no difference between the two groups in that way. Most similar rates around character, right? Those caregivers, parents of people with ASD, about 60% said, yes, my child demonstrates character, similar to groups without ASD. There were also important kind of differences where they were less likely to report experiences of competence, confidence, caring, and contribution. Not everybody, it's not an all or nothing. There were still substantial groups of parents who were saying, yes, I agree to this statement, but many who didn't. So there was overall less thriving according to parent report, right? So why? Why is there less thriving? Can we look at this conceptually and empirically? So why less thriving? We know that ASD status, so if they had an ASD diagnosis, that was related to less thriving. So what explains that line? What mediates that relationship? So the stats people in the room, we did this multiple mediation model, this path analysis model. We controlled for age and we controlled for gender, right? And we asked the question, if we had, with the constructs that we measured, because we didn't measure everything under the sun, with the things that we measured, which ones mattered? So we had 3 internal strengths that we called internal assets, We had their cognitive ability, we had their adaptive behavior according to their parents' report, so their independent living kind of abilities, and we had a measure, an estimate of social communication skill. 3 assets, internal things that they're bringing, that the athlete or the youth is bringing. And we had 3 proxies or indicators of what we said were outside of the person that were part of their contexts. We had the frequency in which they participated in a whole range of home activities, a whole range of school activities, and a whole range of community activities. So that's not, and frequency of participation is not the same thing as involvement, because it's not just about the rate of participation as much as what you're getting out of it, but this is research, and hindsight is always 20/20. So mea culpa. So what did we find with this approach? What plays out in terms of the story, right? To explain that link. So we controlled for age and we controlled for gender. And what we found was that those youth with ASD had significantly lower rates of social communication ability that we already mentioned, and they also had significantly lower rates of participation in home activities and participation in school activities compared to those peers with an intellectual disability who didn't have ASD. There weren't significantly different rates in terms of community participation, right? But these are all youth who are involved in Special Olympics. Also, right? So they're all already engaged, and there's less variability there as well. And those differences in social communication, frequency of home participation and frequency of school participation, predicted who was thriving, the rates of their thriving. Those who had more social communication skill, those who were participating in more home activities and school activities, were thriving more. Also, the frequency of community participation, that somebody, regardless of whether you had ASD or not, the more community participation you were doing, the more likely you were to be rated highly on these measures of thriving. So what you don't see as related to thriving in this sample is the ratings of cognitive ability or the ratings of independent living skills. It actually wasn't correlated, with thriving. It didn't tell us anything about thriving in this sample. Right? And ASD status, there was no difference in terms of ASD status in those other ways. So what does this tell us? That, and in fact, the thing to really take home here is that social communication, the differences between our 2 groups in social communication skill and the frequency of their home and school participation fully explain the story as to why those youth with ASD were reported to thrive less. That it explained that link. It wasn't their diagnosis of ASD. It was the fact that those youth with ASD had lower rated kind of social communication skills. But more than that, it wasn't just about their abilities. right? It was about the differences in their engagement at home and at school. So it's not about putting it on their shoulders as, oh, it's their responsibility. There's a heavy component here of meaningful inclusion as being one of those discrepancies, and that's an inequity. That's something that can be addressed. That's an issue beyond the person. Okay? That's important to consider. So we did have an instance, the first instance, where we said, okay, empirically, there's something in the individual that can explain this and something in the context that can explain this. Right? Something in the individual, something in the context. Lots more research to be done on this, and hopefully that's our next step.